Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply. This video is to bring you a closer look at the Ives 7256 pivot set. This is an Ives center hung pivot intended for doors up to several components I'll show you, intended for doors up to 600 pounds. This would be the base unit, and I have one of the floor pins removed. And I will just go through these one by one and talk about the material. These floor pins are intended to give greater surface area when this bottom floor assembly is rested in a bed of wet cement, basically. A pivot of this size is not intended to be screwed down to a floor. The logic is that a 600-pound pivot is engineered to handle a serious amount of weight, of door weight, 600 pounds in this instance. And screws have been proven to not be able to bear the weight in a proper installation of a pivot like this. The pin, closer look at it, is shaped like this. This is the part that holds it on, the flathead bolt, that quarter 20 bolt that holds it on. It's just meant to give surface area and a way to keep this stable as the concrete is setting. These are removable, which not every brand of pivot is removable, but I find that it's interesting. There is no reference in the instructions whatsoever to screwing these down to the floor. There's no reference to it at all, and that's because it's not to be installed that way. However, I do know that people have screwed these down to the floor against manufacturers' guidelines and have done so with an unknown degree of success. I wouldn't know if that has been successful or not. I simply know that people have told me they've done it. So that this pin I've removed from here to show you the pin in a closer scenario. It's center hung, and most likely if you're looking at a 600-pound pivot, you probably know what that means. If you don't, basically, to keep it simple, the axis of pivoting, the vertical axis of pivoting, is in the center of the door in terms of the thickness of the door. So an 1 3/4 door, this would be at 7/8 of an inch. And in this sort of a center acting scenario, a door could double act. It could meaning go in and out. Here is the floor, the bottom door plate, or door leaf, as Ives calls it. I'm not sure if you would call that a thrust bearing, but that's what I know it as. And it mates to the bearing in the floor portion, allowing a door installed like this to swing in and out, to double act. Because it's center hung, the edge, the style of the door, the vertical edge, needs to be radiused. It needs to have a curve on it, as shown here in the instructions. This dashed line is to emulate the door. The radius, the size of the radius of that radius must not exceed the pivot point to the jamb distance. So what I'm trying to say here is that per the template, you've got 1 3/4, which means that the radius that you do on the door edge cannot be greater than 1 3/4. If it is, the radius won't be tight enough to allow the door to open in and out. This asterisk refers to an idea that the pivot point can be varied as needed. They're only showing 1 3/4 as standard. There are people that have taken this assembly and have installed it 12 inches off the edge, in the center of a door for that matter. Whatever suits the design requirements of the door, of the client, of the architect, of the engineers, and of course obviously of the hardware manufacturer. there are references to in terms of the weight of what this is intended for, and all of that has to be designed together. What the pivot can handle, what the pivot point needs to be, the width, the height of the door. And if you have any questions on your specific applications, by all means reach out to us. So continuing on, you've got the floor portion, the business end of the pivot. You've got the door leaf. And that door leaf, let's just throw a tape measure on it. And I won't measure every part here because, the template or the instructions above this link to this video, it's about 8 1/4, so it's substantial. 1 inch thick, 1 inch wide, and very thick. It looks like it's 3/8 of an inch thick. Yes, it is. It's 3/8. So that's a serious piece of steel there. Moving on, you'll have a finished plate. This happens to be in satin chrome stainless steel for the floor portion. Okay, you'll have screws that will hold that on. Flathead 832 machine thread screws, whatever they are. Now, then you're going to have the bottom screw pack. That is going to give you the screws that you will need to attach the door leaf to the bottom of the door. And that would be mortised in per the instructions. And the depth of the mortise is directly related to the amount of undercut that you want to achieve on the door, between the bottom of the door and the floor in your finished application. There are 4 wood screws and 4 metal screws, depending on your door application. None of these screws are intended to bolt this down to a wood floor. Moving on to the top pivot. This is the standard frame portion of the top pivot for the 7256. This is a spring-loaded bearing at the top. So you'll install this into the header, and when you have the door leaf, and by the way, backing up, this has a finished plate on it as well. It looks like that. And of course, screws to hold it on. This is an access hole. Certainly what it is an access hole to be able to insert a tool and drive this back. It's difficult to do it by hand and holding the item at the same time, but it's spring loaded, and you could insert something in the finished plate, for instance, to drive that in and out, because it's spring loaded. There's a spring inside of there which you can marginally see. Again, finished plate, screws to hold it on. A screw pack for the top for both a wood and a metal application. The portion that mortises into the top of the door is shown here. It's called the door leaf. It's a very thick, heavy piece of metal. Bearing pack. It's substantial. It's, I don't know what it weighs. Feels like it weighs a half a pound. About 4 7/8 overall length. Thicker, like a 1/2 inch thick. 1 1/4 wide at least. This is what mortises to the top. A lot of references in the instructions that the pivot point, the axis, the vertical line of axis, of pivoting axis of the bottom base unit and the top portion must be perfectly plumb. That line must be perfect, otherwise the door is not going to work correctly. Plumb Bob is the tool to use for doing that. Rather than read all of the instructions, these Ives instructions are self-explanatory. There's nothing on here that I see necessary to point out. I have installed these. I've machined many doors for this sort of hardware. It's not very difficult to do. I found the best way for me to do it is to completely absorb the instructions and take the time to set up my tools correctly before going about cutting anything. And it's always worked out just fine. Never a problem with that. There is a link to these instructions above this video. If you have any questions on the Ives 7256 center hung pivot or any other Ives product, please do feel free to reach out to us. Questions regarding application, different pivots to use. It's a good quality pivot. I'm impressed with the fit and finish. For the price, I think it's a real dandy pivot. Real happy with it, and sell a lot of them. So thank you very much.